Today on Blue 58, AJ Dillon has generated a lot more buzz than you'd expect for a guy who only carried 4 times in one preseason game. Is the former second-round pick in danger?
Blue 58!
Hello and welcome to another episode of Blue 58, the one and only podcast of thepowersweep.com. I am your host, John Meerdink, and I'm happy to be with you here for another episode. I got to say, I did not expect AJ Dillon to be the talk of the first Packers preseason game, but here we sit. It's Tuesday evening, and the buzz is just beginning to die down, I think, around Packers Internet about AJ Dillon's performance last Saturday night. 4 carries, 2 yards. That doesn't tell the entire story. It rarely does. Running back stats are pretty fungible. You can go a lot of different directions with running back numbers. And I think as we all know, running backs are not in charge of their numbers in the same way that a lot of other positions on the roster are. The stats that a running back puts up are largely attributed to the offensive line. And I think that's what it comes down to for Dillon's performance on Saturday night. 4 carries, 2 yards, fails to get a yard on 3 straight runs. You can look at the blocking, and it wasn't great. You can look at A.J. Dillon's performance. It didn't look like it was particularly great either, but I want to pull on a couple threads here, basically diving into why this stuff has come up, whether or not it has merit, and why things like this happen to guys like A.J. Dillon, or maybe to just A.J. Dillon specifically. So first and foremost, there are a lot of reasons for this kind of performance. Your running backs can be a problem. The blocking can be a problem. We've said that. I think everybody understands that. This is a uniquely interesting situation here, though, because A.J. Dillon's performance has historically been a lot more tied to offensive line performance than a guy like Aaron Jones, and that really is the knock on Dillon. If you're going to spend premium resources on a running back like the Packers did in 2020, drafting A.J. Dillon with a second-round pick, you need a guy who's more than just a function of the offensive line. Aaron Jones was the sort of guy who could perform independent of the offensive line's performance to a degree. Dillon has never really had that sort of game. Now, to this specific performance, I'm not sure it's that big of a deal. The Packers coaches spoke earlier this week, and they downplayed it fairly substantially. They did not absolve Dillon entirely, but they downplayed it. First, offensive coordinator Adam Stenavich, quote, "Obviously, anytime you get into a short yardage situation and you don't get it, you're pretty disappointed. But just one thing, we got to play with better pad level, and that's across the board. That's every single guy in the play I felt just needed to improve the pad level," end quote. Then we've got running backs coach Ben Sermons. Quote, "We talked about it, just dropping his pads a little bit lower would help, but the circumstances he was in would be hard for most backs. I mean, most premier backs would have had a problem with trying to get the first down in those cases where everything just closes in on you," end quote. Couple takeaways there. Again, absolving Dillon quite faintly, though. Ben Sermons kind of casually throwing out there that A.J. Dillon might not be a premier back. I think we all understood that at that point. But also both of them unprompted bringing up the same issue with pad level that has popped up for A.J. Dillon again and again and again and again in his career. He runs kind of high. That's what he does. And he gets hit low and he goes down. That's been the A.J. Dillon story in his career. But I think there's a lot of reasons for this confluence of takes coming together in this kind of unique tempest in a teapot preseason storyline here. First, I think right out of the gate, we need to point out that A.J. Dillon has not been a great back to this point in his career, and that brings him undue attention. He was the 3rd running back off the board in 2020, and he ranks 5th in rushing in that 2020 class. He's behind both Jonathan Taylor and DeAndre Swift, who were drafted ahead of him. He is behind Antonio Gibson, who was drafted behind him, and he's also behind Jalen Hurts, who famously is not a running back. So not putting up elite numbers relative to other guys in his draft class that were drafted comparably to him and even behind him or don't even play his same position. He also does not rank particularly well if you throw out some wider comparison. He's got a career average of 4.1 yards per carry. That ranks 22nd out of 29 players who have logged at least 500 carries since the year 2020, A.J. Dillon's rookie season. But befuddlingly, I'm not sure if that's an actual adverb there, but in a befuddling development, put it that way, A.J. Dillon is also an oddly successful running back in this exact scenario. if you want to say that AJ Dillon, if you want to say this is not an accurate representation of what AJ Dillon is as a player, in this specific instance, you are actually correct. The numbers really bear it out for you. Success rate is not a perfect stat, but it is a fairly good measure of situational running. Basically, it boils down to how often do you get the yards that you are supposed to get to keep your team on schedule in a given down and distance. On first down, I think it's like 6 yards. On second down, it's whatever 50% of the yards to go. Third down, it's like 90 or 100%, and fourth down, it's 100%, I think. That's off the top of my head. You can look it up. It's in the ballpark there. Basically, you're just trying to say how often do you do what needs to be done when you get the ball in a particular down and distance. Same data set. Running backs who've had at least 500 carries since 2020. AJ Dillon ranks 4th out of 29 running backs in success rate. Second, among all players, fourth out of 29 players in success rate, second among running backs. Jalen Hurts and Lamar Jackson are ahead of him. You would never guess, if I gave you 40 tries, the top running back in that category. It's Latavius Murray. Would not have been on my radar at all. But among running backs, Dillon is second among those 29 players who have had at least 500 carries over the last, 4 years now? Also ahead of Aaron Jones. A.J. Dillon gets the job done in a particular down and distance more often than Aaron Jones. Not a lot more. It's like 55.6% to 55.3%, but still technically more. There is some juice to the idea that this was not a representative performance for A.J. Dillon. He's even largely pretty good in the situations that drew everybody's attention from last week. So we see A.J. Dillon line up in 2nd and 1, 3rd and 1, 4th and 1, and not get it across. He doesn't do it. But in the very specific situation of having 1 yard to go for a first down, A.J. Dillon is actually, surprisingly, very reliable. On 68 career rushing attempts, including playoffs, in that exact situation, any down and distance, 1 yard to go, he has produced 51 career first downs on 68 attempts. That's a rate of 77.27%. He's averaged 3.3 yards per attempt in those situations as well. For comparison, Aaron Jones has converted on 69% of his attempts over his career with the Packers from 2017 to 2023. He had 110 attempts in similar situations, averaged 3.45 yards per attempt. For further comparison, Josh Jacobs had 122 attempts and converted 84 of them. That's 68.8%. He averaged 3 yards per attempt in those situations. And to throw out one further comparison, in this area, just to bring back a running back who got a lot of similar opportunities and actually was kind of run out of town by A.J. Dillon, Jamal Williams, between 2017 and 2020, just looking at his Packers time, had 48 attempts in 1 yard to go situations and produced 39 first downs, a rate of 81.25%. So slightly worse than Jamal Williams, but better than all the other notable Packers backs in that span, better than Aaron Jones and better than Josh Jacobs has been with the Raiders. Interestingly enough, Jamal Williams averaged just over 2 yards per attempt, so he was getting that yard and very little else in those sort of situations. But Dillon, generally speaking, is pretty reliable at producing a first down when he's got 1 yard to go. So, with that as background, why this outcry and what does it mean? I think first the reason that you get this kind of outcry and this kind of fixation on what he did is that this aligns with a lot of negative perceptions about his game. Even if the numbers show that he is generally effective in these situations, if you're being honest, do you feel like A.J. Dillon plays like the 247-pound back that he's listed as? Compare him to the Packers' last notable big back, Eddie Lacy. For all of his issues, Eddie Lacy played pretty big. His game looked big when he was carrying the ball. But interestingly enough, Eddie Lacy only converted 66% of his opportunities in 1 yard run situations. He would be last among that group of running backs that we talked about. The most stereotypical power back the Packers have had in the last decade was not as good in single yard to go situations as the repeatedly criticized AJ Dillon. Interesting. But it's kind of the stereotype for Dillon. He's stereotyped as a back who gets hit and goes down. And then on Saturday you see him get hit and go down, and you're like, well, there it is. There's AJ Dillon again. Secondly, the negative perceptions also happen to align perfectly, but also negatively, with the expectations Dillon has set for himself this season. We've heard nothing but positive stuff from coaches and Dillon himself this offseason about where his game is, where he's going to be, and how he's in the best shape of his life, and how everything's going to be different now. Then he comes out and doesn't look particularly fast or explosive, just kind of looks more of the same. And you say, just a lot of talk. It was not what it was supposed to be. Thirdly, and this is worth keeping in mind, he's always sort of had some outsized expectations because of the idea of A.J. Dillon. Since the Packers drafted him, he's been billed as this freak show guy, this freakish athlete, this giant back who can run and catch and do it all, and he's going to do it while weighing as much as a linebacker, more than a lot of linebackers. But he's never looked like that kind of guy. He's never looked like a freak athlete on the field, really, and he's never played like the big back that he's supposed to be, except for those very specific short yardage situations. But the broken tackle, the yards after contact have never really been a huge part of his game. There's also been some backlash to that backlash, and you start to we're the snake eating its tail at this point. We are coming full circle and then some on this story here. But I find it interesting that people feel compelled to rush to defend A.J. Dillon on the basis of his performance. It is true that Dillon's performance on Saturday was not necessarily his fault and may not be representative of the sort of player that he is on a bigger scope. That is true. But based on his performance to date, is Dillon really the guy that you really want to make sure that you're going out there and going to the mat for, correcting the record on? Okay, if this wasn't representative of his performance, what are you saying then? Like, yeah, he should be able to get a yard, and as we all know, A.J. Dillon is the guy who's going to get us 1 yard a couple times a game. Great. Is that it? Because there should be more than that. That's always been the A.J. Dillon issue. Even the things that he does give you, it's not as much as what you were necessarily promised. This podcast, John Meerdink, put him in the low expectations group for a reason. He's never been an explosive player. Even his best use cases are extremely limited. He can get you exactly 1 yard. Great. What do you do as a pass receiver? What do you do to produce explosive plays in the run? He just hasn't been that kind of guy. It seems a little bit odd to be like, this is the guy that we have to defend. It's almost like the Josh Myers situation from the Packers themselves. Why is it so important to make sure that we defend this performance? And look, I understand that A.J. Dillon is a nice guy. I like Dork County as much as the next guy. And he's been a joy to have around with the off-field stuff since he's been in Green Bay. But the on-field performance last Saturday notwithstanding has just never really been there. So we don't really have to do this. We don't have to make sure that we go out of our way to correct the record on A.J. Dillon, even if some of the record correcting is not necessarily incorrect either. Like, yeah, sure, he can do better in 1 yard situations than he did on Saturday, but overall he just hasn't been that great. So that brings us to the final iteration of this question. What would A.J. Dillon have to do to lose his job in Green Bay? If we just set last Saturday aside and say, okay, there's 2 preseason games left, what would have to happen for A.J. Dillon to go out there and lose his job? I think he would have to play bad in ways that are specifically not his fault. Specifically not the blame of the offensive line. So missed reads in situations where there is a read to be had there, pass protection, stuff like that, not being an asset in the passing game or failing to convert in situations like that. He would have to be, I think, markedly bad in that sort of situation to not get to the 53-man roster. But it's also not out of the realm of possibility that the Packers just decide they want to go in a different direction. He'd only count $167,000 against the cap if he were to be cut, according to overthecap.com. So it's not like you're really tied to AJ Dillon based on his contract here. It would be tricky, I think, to cut AJ Dillon regardless of his performance this summer. You got to be careful with the internal messaging on something like this. AJ Dillon, I think, is enough of a locker room presence that you've got to be careful about what cutting a guy like that would mean to your overall football team. Is the performance that you're going to get from one of these other guys, Emmanuel Wilson, Ellis Merriweather, Jarvian Howard, going to be that much better than what you're getting from AJ Dillon that would justify upsetting the apple cart that way in the locker room? I think that's a pretty tough sell. But what about those other guys? If AJ Dillon is going to have to play so bad that he loses his job on a scale that we can't really adequately encompass in this podcast, the better question might be who's going to step up and take it. And this is another thing that I think you're in a situation where you can't really name a guy who looks like a clear, decisive upgrade. You might be high on Emmanuel Wilson. You might be high on Ellis Merriweather for some reason. You might even be high on Jarvian Howard. I think it's hard to point to a guy and say, this is the guy, and here's why. Just a quick refresher, and I've written about this at thepowersweep.com. Check out the post. We go a little bit more in depth on each of these guys, but just a quick refresher on who we're dealing with here. Emmanuel Wilson would probably be the odds-on favorite. He made the initial 53-man roster last year, was kind of on the periphery of the 2023 team, carried the ball 14 times for 85 yards last year, though 31 of those yards came in a win over the Los Angeles Rams as the Packers were trying to kill clock. He busted off a run, and oddly enough, he ran out of bounds on that one. Also got some burn in the playoffs as A.J. Dillon himself was a little bit banged up. Touched the ball on all 5 of his snaps, for instance, against the 49ers in that game. Not an overwhelming athlete, but not necessarily a poor athlete either. Does move his mass pretty well. Ellis Merriweather signed with the Packers practice squad last November. Again, not an overwhelming athlete either. 4.66 40-yard dash, but did it at 220 pounds. Pretty productive in college. Again, probably not a guy you're just dying to get on your 53-man roster. Jarvian Howard might be the longer-term option here of these 3 backup running backs. I think you can group them together as backup running backs because Josh Jacobs is in for sure. Marshawn Lloyd's in for sure, though he seems to be getting some negative attention from Matt LaFleur this week as well. Howard has, I think, the best overall athletic profile here. Ran a 4.53 40, but at 215 pounds, that's a pretty good score. A pretty good number. Was productive in college. Maybe there's something there. Maybe he's a guy you keep around on the practice squad as well. That might be the longer-term option. But it just doesn't look like there's a guy who's clearly making a run for Dillon's job. I think we might be looking at a situation where the Packers end up keeping 4 running backs if they want to keep a guy who's really going to put a little more heat on Dillon in that situation, but we're probably looking longer term. So that's the running back situation. Didn't intend for this to go 18 minutes here just talking running backs after the first preseason game, but here we are. Also wanted to offer a quick refresher on Grant Dubose, who had himself a little bit of a moment on Saturday night, showing up as Sean Clifford's favorite pass target there. He was a 2023 7th-round draft pick, 8.79 relative athletic score, mid-4.5s in the 40-yard dash, but great off the line, a 1.52 split in the 10-yard dash. Also an elite broad jump at 10 feet 5 inches. Not great in the agility drills, but that's typically what you see from these late-round receivers. Good size, though, 6'2", nearly 6'2.5", 200 pounds. Pretty productive guy in college, too. Finished his career as Charlotte's number 4 all-time leading receiver with 1,684 yards, according to his official Packers bio. Interestingly enough, his official University of Charlotte bio credits him with 5 fewer yards than the Packers do, but I can't account for that difference. Of note, I think this is particularly noteworthy for Dubose here. He played a lot of special teams in college, punt coverage in particular. He was a mainstay on their coverage teams. But last year missed most of training camp with an injury, ended up on the Packers practice squad, was elevated for a single game last year, but did not end up appearing for that game, but was ready and willing to go. it's a tough battle here. The Packers have a very established top four guys: Christian Watson, Jaden Reed, Romeo Doubs, and Dontavian Wicks in some order. And then beyond that, you've got Bo Melton, who was a little bit rough on Saturday, Malik Heath, Grant DuBose, and I'm forgetting somebody here. Yell it out. I'll think of it later. Fighting for a potentially 2 spots, maybe 3. That seems like it would be a lot. 7 wide receivers does not seem super likely this year. So two spots you'd think for sure, though potentially as few as 1 spot, I would think. It's not outside the realm of possibility that they only carry 5 wide receivers this year. Maybe they want to go, maybe you need a 4th running back. Maybe you need a 10th offensive lineman or something. Maybe you want to keep more safeties because Rich Bisaccia seems to be going safety crazy on special teams. Shout out to Justice Mosqueda of Acme Packing Company for breaking down all the special teams film from Saturday night and charting who was playing where and how much. It looks like it's a safeties game on Rich Bisaccia's special teams units this year. So if you are looking to make a roster spot and you're a wide receiver or a running back or a linebacker who's farther down the depth chart, it might be tough for you to do so given what the Packers have been doing with their special teams units to this point. I think worth keeping an eye on DuBose, though, appears to be making a little bit of a charge. Also wanted to talk about Evan Williams just in passing, just because of one of the dumber football things, I believe. You know, we try to be smarter Packers fans here. We try to do process-oriented stuff and track stats that matter and things like that. Here's one that does matter. Evan Williams got his hands on the ball a lot in college at Fresno State and at Oregon, and he did it on Saturday night. His forced fumble was a highlight for me. The version of the dumb thing that I believe about football is the very football coach take that the ball just finds him. There are guys out there who just have this weird knack for getting their hands on the ball, and I suppose that would just be called being good at football, but there are plenty of good corners out there who do not produce a ton of plays on the ball. Jair Alexander is one of them. He gets his hand on the ball. He gets his interceptions and passes defensed sort of in fits and starts. They kind of come in bunches, and then he'll go a long time without ever really having anything happen. He'll just be quiet on the stat sheet for a while. But there are guys that are just consistently making plays on the ball, almost coming out of nowhere to do it. There was a specific play back in 2014 where the Packers were playing the Eagles. It was a Sunday night game, and I don't know who forced the fumble, but suddenly who's there in the backfield to pick up the fumble and scoot whatever it was for a touchdown? It's Casey Hayward. What is he doing in the backfield in that situation? Don't know. But Bob McGinn, then of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, wrote about it and said that it said something like along the lines of, there's Casey Hayward, always Johnny on the spot. And he was very much that way. It didn't matter where he was playing. He just always seemed to have a knack for getting his hand on the ball, getting interceptions, passes defense, to force fumble here and there. Charles Woodson was that way. And Charles Woodson is very much just in the good at football camp here, but again, not all great defensive backs have this skill set or have this ability. Micah Hyde fell into that category, always seemed to know where to be to make a play on the ball. He, too, had a lot of plays on the ball in college, 25 college ball hawks, just for the record. And Williams has that kind of track record, too, 29 college ball hawks, and here he is opening his quote-unquote first professional game, making a play on the ball. It's a weird sort of thing, but you can't help but notice it. And you watch football long enough and you start to notice weird sort of things like this. And it's not analytically sound. I'm not even always sure how good of an idea ball hawks really is as a stat for us to track. And I've realized I've referenced this now a few times without explaining what it is. It's our way of tracking who's making plays on the ball. So sacks, forced fumbles, passes defensed, and interceptions. Figuring that the ball is important, they call it football after all. Guys who make plays on the ball are doing something right on defense more often than not. Williams has that kind of track record. A lot of other great Packers defenders have had that sort of track record. Even some not so great players have. How do we want to put this? They've made a disproportionate impact on the field just because they've had a chance to the ability to make plays on the ball. Demarius Randall comes to mind. The first round pick of the Packers back in 2015, had a couple turbulent years with the Packers, was not ever a real great corner, but he could make plays on the ball, had great ball skills. Clinton Dix kind of in that camp as well. At his best, he had that sort of ability. Yeah, a lot of the interceptions that he caught were overthrows, and it was just because maybe he was playing deep, but he caught them. He was there. They still count, and he could do that. He did make plays on the ball at his best fairly frequently. Darnell Savage at his best was kind of in that vein too. Is this all sort of just voodoo and happenstance? Maybe. But it does seem like finding those guys who have a knack for finding the ball is a good thing. And Williams doing it right out of the gate fits with all of the positive attributes that we've heard and read about him dating back to his time in college. That is his best attribute. He's not an overwhelming athlete. He's not necessarily that big or fast or strong, but he's always made a lot of plays, and he always is a valuable asset to your defense because of those things. So maybe it's not a trend yet, but he has made a lot of plays and interceptions in training camp to this date, and then he opens it up and does it again in a game. Something worth keeping an eye on in his still young rookie season. So you never know. That sort of thing is maybe it's just football coach brain type stuff. Maybe it's the sort of thing like establish the run, or establish the run is just the most perfect one. Or I don't know. I can't think of any stereotypical coach things. You want to take the air out of the ball. You want to control time of possession. You got to get those guys that make plays on the ball. Maybe it is that sort of thing. But I just think it's kind of funny that Williams, who had this knack in college, comes out of the gate doing the exact same thing here with the Packers in his first crack at it as a professional football player. That's all I've got for you in this episode of Blue 58. I appreciate you tuning in. I'd appreciate it even more if you take a second and share this episode with someone you think would enjoy it. That's going to help more people find the show and get more people involved in this conversation you and I are having about the Green Bay Packers, which in turn is going to help all of us, me included, become smarter Packers fans. And as I always say, smarter Packers fans are better Packers fans, and better Packers fans are what we all want to be. I'm your host, John Meerdink. We'll see you next time on Blue 58.